Welcome back to Seek Strength. Today's video is brought to you by the Seek Strength Deadlift program. It is 10 weeks in length, 2 sessions per week, and it contains all your deadlifts and deadlift accessory exercises. Welcome back to our Elite Powerlifter Analysis series. So we've done people like John Hack, who else have we done? Luke Richardson, a couple of other people. We've done a lot of people who are very, very strong, and we'd like to point out some of the good aspects they're doing, so hopefully it can help you with your own training. You'll probably notice some overlay and some consistency across these people and in their lifting and their technical model, and a few other aspects around their stuff that we look at. So today we're looking at Danny Grigsby. So Danny most recently squatted 350 kilos, not pounds, raw. So raw with sleeves, I believe, 207.5 kilo bench press and a 487.5 kilo deadlift at 121 kilos, so in the 125 class. That kind of 120-ish region seems to be the region where the biggest of the leanest humans can live when they're doing strength training. A lot of times if you see in weightlifting, there have been like Anatoly Pisarenko or Chigachev would have been two individuals who would have benefited a lot from a 120 kilo class. It's where just this big human but not fat human class would have been. So when we see people like that in those kind of 120th region, seems to be the region where you get those just big horses, those big beasts. And that's actually where the first point I want to start with for Danny. And we talk about this a lot, but it bears repeating as much as possible. And we talk about this a lot across different sports, but powerlifting is one that benefits a lot from it, and powerlifting is the one that can most easily fit this into their training. And this is Danny's body composition, or more specifically, the amount of lean mass he carries on his frame relative to the amount of fat-free mass, or fat mass I should say, the amount of fat mass he has in comparison to this lean mass. So aka Danny is as jacked and as lean as he could possibly be while still being a competitive athlete. So muscular definition, he has a large amount of muscle on his frame, minimum amount of fat on his frame, while obviously still being able to make weight and live his daily life accordingly. Now of course, in Danny's case, it's obvious there's a lot of things helping him be in this particular condition, but the same applies still to natural powerlifters. And you know, a lot of natural powerlifters still have very good physique because they're in this position where you can train a lot of hypertrophy, and this benefits you hugely for your training because muscle mass is a huge predictor of force production. It's one of the aspects involved in increasing your strength, so it's a really important aspect. And as a powerlifter, unless you're in that kind of open largest category, having the most amount of lean muscle mass for you is super important. So we'll always be encouraging our powerlifters of all athletes to make sure that your body composition is on point. That sounded strange. On point. So making sure that you have as little body fat as you can possibly have while still being very, very productive. So I'm not looking to be as lean as possible, but making sure that we can sustain as much muscle mass and train productively throughout the year without becoming sloppy. So I just have
one thing I think people often say is like, oh, that's more for non-tested federations. It's like, oh, it's easy for them to be in great shape because they're not tested or because they're using whatever. I think it's more important for natural athletes to be in phenomenal shape in terms of low body fat percentages, carrying a large amount of lean tissue mass. It's more difficult to get there, obviously, but you get a hell of a lot more out of a very good physique. And obviously, if you're not using any substances, it's very important that you're in good shape and you're not carrying around a lot of extra flab, a lot of extra fat. Yeah,
in fact, you'll actually have to focus on this more than someone who is using performance enhancing drugs, because it will be harder for you to maintain the muscle mass, to grow that extra muscle mass. So it's actually something that should be a pretty big priority in your training. So there's an interesting study from Slovenia. It's actually a little bit of United Kingdom involved in this, but primarily from Slovenia. It's called Factors Underlying Bench Press Performance in Elite Competitive Powerlifters. I am not going to pronounce any of the authors' names, but you can go find the study yourself. So it's published in the Journal of Strength and Conditioning. And I like these kind of studies where they just investigate aspects of elite athletes and just look at commonalities between them and see what was very, very common amongst their performance. So I'm not doing any interventional studies where, you know, there's a lot of open to interpretation. There's a lot of issues with designing those studies, whereas when we just go analyze these athletes, you just go poke these big strong people with a stick, or these fast athletic people, and you just see what's really common, what was the most common trait among those athletes. I like those because it's very, very beneficial when you're looking across decades and athletes and you're looking what was the most kind of common trait. So the highest degree of association with performance, so they had 16 elite national, 13 elite national and international level male powerlifters, 26 plus or 9 years 178 centimeters plus or minus 6, and they were 93 kilos plus or minus 9.9 kilos. They visited the laboratory, got some anthropometric and ultrasound measures. The highest degree of association was shown for structural, so lean body mass, brachial index, arm circumference, and agonist cross-sectional area. Then followed by that was like neuromuscular factors, so like elbow and shoulder strength. But the highest and the most common thing among them, or the most related to the bench press performance, was that lean mass, so muscle mass or muscle fibers produce that force. So for powerlifting, having as much of that as possible is very, very important. I like those poking stick studies.
In the old cross-sectional area.
Yeah, I like them.
Yeah.
Their lowest found in was technical factors that did not correlate with 1 RM bench press, but I think that's probably due to the nature of elite level lifters and something we'll get to a different time. So it's probably not great for teaching you guys stuff, so we'll leave that in the bag. Now, on to Danny's lifts. What's up first, Fitz?
So deadlift is the first thing we're going to talk about, or deadlift with an asterisk, obviously, because it's sumo. But Danny is a phenomenal sumo deadlift. I'm not sure what his PB on it is. I know on one of the videos we're watching, it's like just under 1,040 pounds or something for his deadlift. There's a couple of areas of his deadlift that I really think all lifters could look into and maybe bring into their own game. Obviously, you're probably not 120 kilos of lean, mean lifting machine, but particularly when you look at his start position, how he addresses the bar at the start, how he locks out the bar at the end, there's definitely some positives there. So the first thing I'd like you to look at is his use of a dynamic and static start, right? So dynamic start will be you moving into a position where you start the lift and then there being no pause and you beginning your first pull or whatever you want to call it. And then a static start will be you in an isometric hold for a number of seconds and then you starting movement with the bar, right? What you'll see Danny using is he uses a combination of both, right? So obviously when you're lifting very heavy weights like this on a deadlift bar or even on a stiff bar, it's going to flex with over 1,000 pounds on it. There's a lot of slack to take out of the bar, right? There's a lot of tension to be made up in the bending of the steel. In this case, it's probably around 4 to 5 centimeters of slack you need to take out of the bar. What you see Danny doing is he uses a dynamic start to take the slack out. So it's dynamic start, obviously you can produce a lot of force very easily with very little energy expenditure. So he's not using up any of that isometric hold to take the slack out of the bar. He's not using up any additional energy. He uses a small bit of a dynamic start, brings his hips down, rips that bend into the bar, then he pauses for a second and he starts with his normal static start that many of you might use. I think as you're getting into heavier weights and you're learning about taking the slack out of the bar, having a dynamic start to take the slack out of the bar, then a millimeter or a microsecond pause at the end of that to ensure your position is correct, and then going into your proper pull will be very, very beneficial.
I actually want to harp on about a start position as well, because I think it is probably one of the best ones. It's akin to Steffi Cohen's, so this is probably the best start position I've seen of any male sumo powerlifter doing the deadlift. So the main thing with his is how vertical he is in that start position. That's really the benefit of the sumo deadlift. I think it's a mistake a lot of people make, especially kind of intermediate all the way down to amateur powerlifters when they're doing the sumo deadlift. They don't take advantage of your ability to be as upright as possible and be able to use your legs maximally from the floor. So it is very, very useful. So if you look at his external rotation, where his knees are tracking over his toes, he's a huge amount of external rotation strength here. His upper body is near vertical. On his best reps, he keeps that vertical torso as he pulls. On some reps, he just guides himself forward just a little bit. But on the really most powerful reps you'll have of his, you'll see him. He literally is like an elevator or a piston. It's straight down. He's into that really vertical start position. He's super externally rotated. And then... he's super externally rotated. He's as upright as possible. He has all that slack pull out of the bar like Fitz was talking about. He's also using the hook grip as well, which I actually think is very beneficial for most sumo deadlifters. The mixed grip has a lot of benefit, of course, for the grip strength or ability to grip the barbell. But when it comes to the start position, I think the double overhand hook grip is more beneficial for our sumo deadlifter start position, because the little mix of grip, I think, affects someone's ability to be as upright as possible. I think with this, double overhand hook grip, you can really extend your shoulders and be as upright as you possibly can be in the start position. And I think the difference is minimal, but I think it is very important when we're looking for this maximal position in the start of the sumo deadlift. A lot of the areas where people fall down is they lack a lot of external rotation strength in their hip, and they have a lot of abduction strength and adduction strength. They limited both by this kind of control of their hips and their ability to open them up. This isn't really going to be a position where you can be passive, so just having external rotation hip control, or just having passive external rotation range of motion, I should say, isn't going to be something that is massively beneficial to you unless you have the control to keep it open. Because if you just have a lot of range of motion in your hip and you can externally rotate a lot, as soon as you start pulling, if you don't have a lot of control in your abduction or adduction, it's your ability to keep your knees pushed out or in. If you don't have a lot of this control, as soon as you start pulling, you're probably going to lose those positions. Whereas if you have this passive range of motion and then you have the strength to keep it open as much as possible, it'll benefit you hugely for that start position. I think if you look at Danny's legs, it's a good indicator.
Very good indicator, yeah.
If you look at, like, there's a video of him deadlifting from the side in a green virus singlet. If you look at the size of his ass and his glute med muscles, like, they're literally, looks like someone has stuffed a roll or something underneath his belt. So that should give you a good indication. Clearly he has the mobility, so we can see, because he has that range of motion. But then when you look at his control there is zero change. It's similar to, like, Toshiki when he's back squatting. This ability to keep this external rotation, keep that knee tracking is incredible. Most people's hips, it's so uncomfortable.
Yeah, absolutely. Your hips shouldn't do that. But just to segue on from Gersh's point to talking about his knees, the next point I really like about Danny's deadlift is just the normalness of his lockout, right? So it's something that's really come up in the last 5 or 6 years, that we tend to see sumo deadlifters squeezing with a normal bar path so that the velocity of the bar doesn't really change. Then as they get towards lockout, they slam their knees into full extension. In a lot of points they slam their knees into excessive extension, so they hyperextend the knee joint. And it's because this feels great at the top, so you've basically not moved the barbell at all. You're coming up to the top and then you just slam your knees into hyperextension because it feels like you're really locked out then, and you've made a good point of locking out the rep. That's troublesome for a number of reasons, right? Or problematic for a number of reasons. The first reason is sumo deadlifts aren't usually failed off the floor. They're usually failed in the last 3 or 4 inches of the lift, because people's grip goes and people's ability to fully lock out goes. Obviously that super wide stance with the legs is great because it limits range of motion, but to lock out our quads and our legs in that manner, and to fully open our hips in that manner, isn't very easy. It would be much easier to stand with your feet straight underneath your hips than it would be to stand in some sort of split position where your feet are all the way out to the side. And that's what's happening on the sumo deadlift. When you start slamming your knees back and having that really jerky lockout, you're firstly taxing your grip in a way you don't need to tax the grip when it's already at its weakest point. But then you're also really limiting your ability to actually raise the bar anymore. Once your knees go into that hyperextended position, you can no longer put any force in with your quads. Your knee joint is essentially backwards. Your quadriceps, all 4 of them, are at their shortest point, and they're no longer working for you. The only thing you can basically do is put the weight onto your heels and try and pull your shoulders back. You see in Danny's deadlift, it's just smooth the whole way. There's no weird snappy lockout. He just keeps pulling on that bar and he stops when he gets to the top.
Next, I want to move on to Danny's bench press. So Danny's bench press is probably the weaker of his 3 lifts. When I say weak, he's still benching north of 200 kilos. He seems to have a lot of momentum going in his deadlift. And if you look at his PBs of that kind of 207 or 205 or 202 in training, these aren't very maximal. I think he's probably putting in a lot of work with us, and I bet you will see him benching north of 220 before next summer or something like that, judging by how these are moving and how his training seems to be going. The main thing I want to look at in his bench press that I want you to look at is kind of pay attention to how consistent this angle here, or his forearm relation to his wrist, is from either the side angle or from the front. So there is some talk about elbow flare, shoulder flare in the bench press. Some people seem to do quite well with it, others simply don't. Typically what I've seen for the vast majority of people, unless they're built very, very strangely or have incredible arm length, is we see a really consistent angle here pressing, and it probably makes the most sense. So we don't see a huge amount of extreme elbow tuck, so we don't see this elbow angle changing towards, or we don't see this opening up as it gets to the bottom, and we definitely don't see it opening up as we get to the bottom and pressing. So ideally what we really like to see, and I think Danny's a good example of this, is just the consistency of this angle here. So when we come down, this angle is coming straight down. This is staying in this position, in this kind of straight line as much as possible. There will be some variance, of course, when you're pressing, depending on your body type and where your grip is. But what we really like to see, it allows for a very consistent pressing position. It seems to be one of the most powerful positions for people on average from what we've seen. So keeping this angle here nice and normal. And then if we look at it from the side, we would see that we wouldn't see any, because of that extreme elbow tuck, if you tucked your elbows too much, you'd see that this elbow angle would probably come forward just a little bit too much and reduce the consistency and reduce the power we'd have initially off our chest. So if you look at that from the side, you'd see that this angle, that forearm angle in relation to his elbow and his shoulder, would stay quite consistent and in a reasonably straight line. Not, of course, an exact straight line, but I think Danny's a great example of someone who does that very well. And if you look at his arms, they're not incredibly short. If you look at him when he's deadlifting, when he's standing, his hands are reaching below his hips. So it's not exactly someone who's got super short arms that are doing a technique that's not viable for everyone. I think the consistency of this and the use of this is definitely viable for a lot of people.
The other part of Danny's bench that I think most people can learn something from or could bring into their own game is just his feet, knees and hips, and how well he sets himself up. So a lot of the time when we see people trying to develop tension in the bench press, they'll have their kind of, so imagine they'll have their ankle underneath their knee and their knee and that kind of upper and lower leg at 90 degrees to each other. So you're just lying normally on the bench, you might have your knees out slightly, but most of the time you have your shins almost vertical to the floor. What you'll see with Danny doing is he's pulling his feet, so firstly his feet go wider than you normally see, but also he's pulling his feet back. So what this is doing is it's developing tension on the front of the quads. It's also developing tension in your anterior hip flexors, your anterior core. So now when you get set up into a position, firstly you're less likely to be raising your ass off the bench because your hips are under more tension, but also you're a hell of a lot more stable. So you have wide feet and wide legs that are under tension the whole time, and then as you bring the bar down, you're really well able to develop tension and put a lot of force into the bar. And I do think that is a major issue with a lot of people's bench presses, that their feet might be on the floor but they're probably just kind of straight underneath their knees and they're not actually developing tension. If anything, they're just priming their legs to start pressing their ass up into the air when the benches get heavy.
Finally, we want to talk about Danny's squat. So I really like Danny's squat. Danny has a squat that a lot of the strongest people currently competing in powerlifting have, who are not these ultra super heavies. And these is this kind of squat we call, where it's kind of a hybrid, where you've certainly a low bar position, but you're squatting very, very similar to high bar positions. Now, it's not exactly the same as a weightlifter squat and high bar, where you're looking for maximal knee flexion, you're looking for the greatest step you can manage. Rather, what we see with a lot of these great lifters, and John Hack for example, in the same meet squatted with similar positions, John actually just seemed to use a high bar itself, not even a kind of low bar with high bar position. So we see Danny like squats like this, we see Shane Hunt squats like this. So he has a low bar position, but we see basically equal amounts of kind of hip and knee travel is the way we like to break it down, or the way we like people to focus on. So we see those knees going quite well over the toes, and you see those hips going back. So we get this maximal use of our lower body. We see this quite straight bar pat. If you were looking to the side, it stays in quite a nice window. For powerlifting, I actually prefer the use of the low bar position when you're doing this style of squat, because you can get that barbell further back over your heels a little bit. So the tendency then is that the barbell is most likely to stay over your front foot, because typically what we see, bars usually move forward in that bar pat when we're back squatting. And so if we have this low bar back squat position but doing this kind of high bar squat, so we see those hips go back and knees go back equally at the same time, we end up seeing a nice even bar pat, and we stay very well balanced with that bar pat. The other thing I really like about Danny's squat is he actually squats quite wide in relation to his hips or shoulders. Typically, if we were doing a high bar squat, for example, we'd usually keep our hips underneath, our feet underneath our hips, I should say. But for Danny, for example, there's a video of him repping, I think, something like 650 for a triple, and his feet are slightly wider than shoulder width, and maybe they're just outside shoulder width. And you'll see this works quite well, because Danny squats very, very deep, of course. Now, these squats are very legitimate, there's no question of them. He could certainly squat deeper if he wanted to, but there's no need in the competitive sport of powerlifting. But what I really like about this is it really lets us maximize the use of our quads and ass, our quads and buttocks, if you translate from Russian, in the squat when we squat this wide. But we can do this, if we were to do this wide of a squat stance, and if we were going to full depth, we'd end up in a very compromised position at the bottom, and we'd lose a lot of the use of our quads from the bottom. It'd be very, very awkward. But when you're squatting to below parallel, to competition depth, this slightly wider stance really puts us in a very powerful position at just below parallel in this high bar low bar kind of squat hybrid that we're seeing a lot of people do. And it's interesting to see more and more of them are squatting like this, and interesting to see a lot of them are kind of coming to the conclusion of their own accord, as opposed to that kind of low bar squat we were talking about, which of yesteryear, which we used to see primarily from equipped lifters, and people did try it a lot for a while after equipped lifting kind of fell by the wayside. We still got people trying to make this very ass dominant low bar squat where we'd sit back and try to keep the shin angle vertical, which we just see doesn't really work. We see that this position for the strongest people in the world works incredibly well in this kind of hybrid type squat, whereas when we see people in gyms, still see a lot of amateur powerlifters squatting, trying to squat with this low bar position, but then using their ass and lower back as much as possible, and they're essentially minimizing the use of their quads, but also their posterior chain in this style of squat just isn't up to scratch for let alone a performance enhancing lifter, but even just can't even mention how hard this is on a amateur powerlifter who's not using performance enhancing drugs. Yeah,
one or two other things about his squat. The thing I really like, aside from the things Gerf has mentioned, is his hand position. So a lot of the time when we get this, so it's a low bar position, if we get the hands coming in, so I like the hands to be quite close because it allows you to develop more tension in your upper back. If our hands are way out here, out by the collars, it's very, very difficult to develop any tension in my upper back to get those subscaps, your traps, your lower traps engaged. So with the hands coming in, a lot of the time we see bigger lifters bringing their hands in on the low bar squat. You get this kind of weird claw grip. It's like your man from like Scary Movie 2, like my strong hand. You get this weird claw grip where they're super extended at the wrist. That's not a strong position for me to develop tension. You'll see all of them will wear wrist straps. They're not going to be able to hold a lot of weight, much less develop a lot of tension there. So I like this. Danny is as straight as wrist as possible. His elbows pulled in and tucked back. I really like that. I think it really keeps his upper back in a very, very good position, and allows his legs and back to do the work.
Squeeze in really, really tight, and loose.
The last thing I like about his squat is the tempo. I think we see a lot of, particularly knee sleeve lifters, dropping fast into the hole, whereas Danny is dropping down using that stretch shortening cycle and driving up at a nice pace, but everything seems to be controlled. There's no kind of crazy drop down and bounce and then a really kind of wobbly stand up. Everything is very controlled. Speed is well controlled. Everything looks very well thought out.
One final minor comment. So in some of our videos we talked about this straightforward toe position, like you'll see for example with John Hack. Danny has a slightly or very much closer to straightforward, but not quite, and I think some people got the impression that we're saying everyone should be squatting toes forward. It's definitely not what we're saying. It's an option and it can be very, very useful, but it depends on your kind of hip structure, your limb lengths, your, again, mobility, what kind of style squats you're using. So it doesn't have to be toes forward. Toes forward works really well for some people. I think some people make the mistake of assuming, what we're trying to clear up is that everyone has to squat toes out in heavy squats. It is certainly a viable option to be toes forward for some lifters if you can maintain the right structure. Usually what you see is the lower back is an issue for the super toes forward, as in it takes a lot of the load, because its ability to maintain an upright position and lots of dorsiflexion is tough for some people. So I hope you enjoyed the video. Let us know if there's any other lifters you'd like to see in relation to just kind of strength world and we want analysis of. We very much enjoy doing them, and it's great to see them because, as we say, there's a lot of very strong people out there, and it's great to watch what they're doing and see the kind of commonalities and the good points of them. My strong hand. It's my strong hand. I squeeze him really, really tight and I let loose. Yeah.